First, I'm aware of the irony of talking for an hour about silence. So I am aware, especially for those who know me, I'm not like the least talkative person. So that is what it is. We'll see what we can make of it. And I think we'll actually we'll even see a little bit of tension around this question in some of the texts about, we can talk about the values of silence and talking less, and then we can also see some pushback against that, let's say. So what I wanted to do today, we'll see how the time goes, is I wanted to open with sort of a larger entry into this topic, and then at least begin and maybe finish, want to talk about how I want to think about things. Oh, thank you for spotlighting me. How I want to think about things, which is, I think, like, there's only so much abstract talking about silence that can get you. That's not really where I was going here, though maybe that is interesting. I wanted to talk about particular areas of halakha where we experience speech restrictions, let's say. And today we'll speak a little bit about Shabbat, I hope. So that's the plan, right? Sort of a more broad opening, speak about Shabbat. Maybe we'll get through that whole thing about Shabbat. Maybe some will carry over to next week. It's great to see some new and old faces. So hello. Okay, so the source sheet, I'm going to open your version of the source sheet to make sure I have it. And I'm tempted to not share it with you if you all have it, although I know some people maybe you can like message me or hi if you think that's a bad idea because you have some technical reason that it's easier for me to share it with you. But I have the first two sources basically are just to open the topic of humans and speech and what we're about. The first is the beginning of Breshit. Well, oh, okay, all right, I could do that. Please share. Now the question is, which of my many, many, many open tabs is the one to share? I think this is the one. You guys can see that? And now it's big, and I'll make it a little bigger. Okay, the first, so I want to say from the beginning of Breshit, which is kind of only sort of true because, as some of us know, Breshit really has two sort of beginnings and two creations of human. And in the second version of the creation of humans, it says that God formed the human dust out of the earth and blew into his nose nishmat chayim, the breath of life. Vayhi adam lenefesh chaya is the Hebrew. The human became, I would translate nefesh chaya as a living soul, living being, living something, right? But interestingly here, so what we have here is the Targum Onkelos, which is the Aramaic translation, or one of, and probably the most well-known Aramaic translation of the Torah, and it translates nefesh chaya. Neither the word nefesh nor chaya seems to be translated directly. Neither sort of like being, living being, or alive seems to be translated. The translation is ruach mimalala. Ruach is arguably kind of like nefesh, something like your breath. Mimalala means, you have in English, but mimalala means speaking, right? And this is sort of what's unique about humans in this conception is that humans have the capacity to speak. Every time there's one of these, there's a lot of debate about to what degree different animals have language. This is one of the places where like traditional Jewish texts feel tension, I think, some of those reports. But right there, the human capacity is, the unique human capacity in the Garden of Eden is speech, right? So that's sort of one side. Is there something about us that is inherently talky? On the other side, or maybe not on the other side, that doesn't mean that all speeches that just like go forth and chatterbox. I always like to tell this story when I have several children who like to talk, but one of them really likes to talk, and right before COVID, she was like 4 or 5, before like the initial COVID situation, she asked us to get this book from the library called Wordy Birdie, about a bird who also really likes to talk. And we had this book for like 6 months in our house because the library was closed, the Wordy Birdie. So like, some people are wordy birdies and it's good, and some people are really wordy birdies. If you have a wordy birdie child, you can get this book also. It's very cute. And if you don't care about children's literature, I'm sorry, I do. But that was partly for you to read because I know you have some children's literature things going on. Anyway, so right, there's something about humans that's like talkative, right? At the same time, right, there's different ways that we can experience speech. So here's a Gemara from Brachot. Brachot I think one of the things we're going to see today is a little bit of a difference maybe on this topic between the Yerushalmi and the Bavli, between the sort of Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. So Brachot is the very beginning of the Talmud, very beginning of the Mishnah, and it starts with the laws of reciting Shema, which is a verbal recitation. And one of the things that comes up is, do you, what should I say, right? Do you interrupt Shema if you're learning Torah? The Mishnah actually says, right, for example, if you say Shema after the time, well, at least you're still learning Torah, even if you're not doing the mitzvah of Shema. There's a few different ways that sort of like saying Shema versus learning Torah, perhaps out loud, interact. And this Gemara seems to be coming off of that, and it quotes two opinions. I'm gonna begin at the beginning. First of all, for those who don't know the citation conventions for the Yerushalmi, it doesn't have like a standard pagination the way that the Talmud Bavli does. So it's by chapter and halacha. So this is halacha really is the Mishnah. So this is the first chapter of the Yerushalmi, the Gemara on the second Mishnah. So I'll start with just maybe to summarize this little there's a machloket here, and it's not super necessary for us, but it's kind of interesting, and it keys into some other things that we may know about some of these characters. So Rabbi Yochanan b'shem Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, right? Rabbi Yochanan, who's sort of in one of the transitional, like early Amoraim, he says in the name of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai that kigon anu, people like us, she'oskim b'talmud Torah, who are engaged in the study of Torah, afilu l'kriyat shema ein anu mafsikin. We don't stop even for kriyat shema, which I don't know if this rings any bells with other things we know about Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. Right? We learn Torah so literally all the time, we don't even say kriyat shema. Like Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai's perhaps most famous story, spends however many years sitting in a cave learning Torah. You can nod even if I can't see your head, right? Or not, right? So like Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai is sort of associated and becomes maybe even more so over time associated with this like extreme Torah and Torah only position. There are other stories where maybe he moderates it, but that's his baseline, right? Like we just learn Torah all the time. So Rabbi Yochanan says that's what Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai says. But Rabbi Yochanan Amra al Garme, he said Garme is like Aramaic for or a different kind of Aramaic for Atzmo. He said about himself, right? Kigon anu, they both mean bones actually, right? Etzem means bone and Gar means bone. When you say about my al Atzmo, you're saying about my bones, right? Okay. So he says, Rabbi Yochanan says about himself, Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai said, we spend all our time learning Torah, so we don't say Shema. But kigon anu she'ein anu oskim b'talmud Torah, we who don't really learn Torah. Now, like Rabbi Yochanan is an Amor. He doesn't probably mean he actually doesn't learn Torah. He means that like he, maybe he spends a lot of time learning Torah, but not all his time. And maybe the people in his time like don't really learn so much Torah at all, right? Afilu l'tefila on a mafsik, right? So we stop learning Torah even to pray because, like it's not like we're so careful to spend all our time learning Torah, so we can't say like, oh, we don't have time for tefillah. I spent today at a professional development thing, whatever, and one of the stories that came up several times is somebody asked a rabbi, I have 1/2 hour a day to learn Musar, right? Sort of like ethical, personal improvement, or should I use it to learn Musar or to learn Talmud? And the answer is, if you learn Musar, you'll realize you have more than 1/2 hour a day. So it seems like he's kind of like that. He's not saying that we don't learn Torah. He's saying that like, we don't learn Torah all the time. So it would be false of us to say that when we skip Shema because we skip prayer for learning Torah, like it's because we're learning Torah. Really, it's because we were doing something else earlier, and that's why we don't have time for it. So we're going to stop even for prayer, meaning prayer maybe is a lesser obligation than Shema. So Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai only learns Torah. He won't stop even for Shema, whereas Rabbi Yochanan will stop even for tefillah. So that's that's the beginning. Din kadate, but din kadate, and each of them follows their own opinion. Rabbi Yochanan kadate. Rabbi Yochanan follows his opinion. Rabbi Yochanan omer u'levai shemipalel adam kol hayom. He thinks like actually prayer is not. His earlier statement was kind of dismissive, but actually wouldn't it be great if people could pray all day? Right, like that would be fine. Prayer itself is maybe his sort of like that's his mitzvah maybe, right? That's one of his points of connection. Lama she'ein tefillah mafsedet, right? Prayer is never in vain, right? Prayer is like a great activity, and we could do it all day. We can't do it all day. Why can't we do it all day? Maybe we need to eat. We have to do other things, right? But like, meaning not only do we need to eat, we need to do activity that allows us to eat. But if we could, we would spend all day in prayer. But Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, as I sort of mentioned before, is not that. If he could, he would spend all day learning Torah. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai follows his opinion. When he said, I don't stop learning even for Shema, he said, Ilu havina kaim al Torah de Sinai. If I had been there, this is like in the English, the underline Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said, the second. If I had been back there at Mount Sinai, b'shata di'yavi Torah, when the Torah was given to Israel, and so this is a very interesting thing, what he's going to say. Havina mitbae komim rachmana, diyitre levar nasha train pumim. I would have requested before God, which is kind of like you have this in the Targum also, you have sort of this euphemistic language, but lifnei hamakom, similar in Hebrew, right? Before God, you don't say you would ask God, you say you ask before God, because God isn't really a person. It's a little bit of sort of a way of creating distance. So I would have asked before God that there would be humans would get created two mouths. Right? One to exert himself, as in English, in Torah, and the other one to avadei kol tzorcha, and the other one to do all the other stuff. That way, even when you're on the job as a telemarketer or when you're doing business or whatever it is, you can still be learning Torah with your other mouth, which I think is really interesting for, many reasons. Definitely happy to hear either things people say or feel free to put stuff in the chat. But one of the things that's interesting about it is that learning Torah here is a verbal activity, right? It's not like I can learn Torah by going it over in my head while I'm doing my business, right? You want to be able to speak it. And that's why you can't stop it to say Shema, because it's something that has to come out of your mouth. Also, the placement of Har Sinai as the time when you could ask for like a fundamental change in the nature of humans is also very interesting. Maybe like if I had been back there at the creation, I would have said, give us two mouths. Maybe the point is, if you're giving us the Torah, give us the capacity to fully immerse ourselves in it. But so that's what he would have thought. Chazar Umar, but then he went back and he said, Umar in chadhu late al mayachim kaive. And then he said, with one mouth, the world can't exist for it. Min dili Torah delay, from its Deli Torah is kind of like a snitch. It seems like it's what we would call lashon hara. It's sort of the way it talks badly about others, right? With one mouth, we already use it for so much bad stuff. Ilu havu train right? If we had two mouths, actually, it's true. I, Shimon Bar Yochai, might use one mouth only for Torah and the other mouth only when necessary to do business. But most people would just say twice as much gossip, and that would be bad. So I think here, right, on the one hand, we have this idea that speech, right, the things we produce with our mouth, not just our internal orientations, but the things we produce with our mouth can be sort of like the ultimate form of connection with God, either through speaking Torah or speaking prayer, right? And on the other hand, that in reality, we're not living up to that most of the time. And that maybe a little bit sets the stage for what we're going to see elsewhere. In terms of the ideal and the real, or the aspirations, for what you could do with speech. When we talk about silence, are we saying silence is inherently good in some way, or are we saying silence is good because people use their powers of speech in bad ways? I think that's going to be one of the central tensions that will come out a little bit in the next section. So I started, this was even in I'm going to be on source 3. I forgot, as always, to put page numbers on this handout, it looks like. I wish there was maybe there is a default to change that in Google Docs, but I don't know it, so sorry. So I'm on source 3. I think I put this in the course description, right? There are many statements about silence is golden in rabbinic literature. This is one of them. I am not holding in everything that everyone has said about all of those things, I will confess. But also, as we're going to see, I think that these general statements about speech and silence can kind of become a canvas for people to say whatever they want. And that's one of the reasons that by the end of the class, I want to move towards looking at a specific case study. So in Mishnah Avot, in the end of the first chapter of Avot, Shimon beno, here, this is Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, as many of us know, right? I'm sorry. You shouldn't say as many of us know, because if you know it, then you feel good about yourself. But if you don't, then you just feel bad. So I apologize. But anyways, Pirkei Avot is organized basically in order, or much of it is organized in order of sort of people and their children or students trying to sort of replicate the chain of tradition. it starts with Moshe received the Torah at Har Sinai. He taught these people, they taught them, and each of them sort of says things along the way. So the previous Mishnah is by Rabban Gamliel, and this is Shimon Beno, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. So Shimon ben Gamliel said, Kol yamai gadalti ben chachamim, right? I grew up my whole life around the sages, which is an interesting thing for him to say, right? Because he's sort of the child of this house of Nesiim of the Sanhedrin, right? Like this sort of very prominent house of rabbis. So I've grown up with rabbis all the time. Right, and I found nothing better for, well, I'll read the English, for a person than silence. And so he has three things. A lot of things come in threes in Pirkei Avot. So he says, I found nothing better for a person except silence. And study is the most important thing, not study is the most important thing, but actions. Excuse me, right? And anybody who speaks too much, brings sin upon themselves. So this is three things. How many, is there a core idea? I'll ask another thing. What does midrash really mean? There are a few words that were kind of, I think, glossed over in English. Maybe that's the first one. When he says midrash, what does he mean? Right? Action, maybe performing mitzvot or doing something is the most important, as opposed to what?
Studying about it, talking
right.
about it.
Talking
exactly.
About it. That studying, I didn't see who that was in my thing, but thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Studying is not like sitting with a book. First of all, the Torah Shabbat is not in books at this time, but midrash, like expounding on the Torah Shabbat, let's say, even if it means technically or something else, right, is a verbal thing. It's something you do, right, either with others or you repeat out loud to yourself, right? Your shoneh, your hilkhot, right? You sort of say things over to yourself. So this kind of speech is not the important thing. Rather, it's doing stuff. And if you talk too much, you end up sinning, right? There seems to be a theme through all of these of like, talk less, do more. And we could have a song cue there, but that's the first thing. The second thing is that this is going to come up later. This phraseology of lo matzati laguf tov ela shtika, right? Actually, two more things, right? One is that I haven't found for a goof better than silence. I think it is a pretty normal way to say a person, but goof literally means body, and we can already maybe start to imagine how that particular word choice will open up interpretative possibilities later, right? Why specifically your body and speech? What does that have to do with anything? So we'll get there soon, I hope. The second thing is that there actually are, I actually had this funny moment with this. What I had remembered is lo matzati laguf tov mishtika, and then I looked it up. And I think I might have even searched for that, and it didn't come up exactly as I wanted. I was like, oh, I guess I remembered it wrong. But it turns out actually there's two girsot, there's two texts of this midrash, of this Mishnah. Again, not so different in meaning, but possibly. Lo matzati laguf ela shtika, tov ela shtika. I haven't found anything good for a person except shtika, or maybe I have only found good for a person in silence, versus I haven't found anything better for a person than silence. They could have slightly different valences, and as we're going to see, there are certain kinds of creative readings that only work with one of those texts. So that's our Mishnah. We could have started in other places. We could have started with siag lechochma shtika, right? A fence for wisdom is silence. As one of my colleagues in high school told me, this is one of the wisest things he said. In high school, siag lechochma shtik. That in order to create wisdom in your students, you have to be a little wacky, which is also interesting, but that's, there are many other places we could have started, but this is where we are. And I just want to show some different ways that people read this Mishnah to kind of show, in some ways, how people bring their own preconceptions to the table. Almost similar to what we see with Rabbi Yochanan or Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, depending on their worldview, what the Gemara says about them, right? Depending on their worldview, they're going to say something different about this situation. So I'll start with kind of like a basic Bartanura, Rabbi Bartanura. Did not look up where and when he lived before this class, so sorry. But I'm sure somebody else is now going to be motivated to put that in the chat, and I will thank you. So Rav Gedwiser is one of sort of like the classic commentaries on the Mishnah. He's sort of the basis of the Gahati commentary that a lot of us may have used. So he says, what does it mean? I haven't found any good, like, what does it mean that silence is good for people? It's a particular kind of silence. It's actually not about listening instead of talking. It's about somebody who hears himself being disparaged and doesn't say anything, right? This is a midos thing, right? It's a character thing that you shouldn't be the kind of person who you hear one thing and you have to yell at the person to make sure they're wrong. They know that they're wrong or whatever it is. You don't get into it with somebody just because they insult you, which I think is very interesting. I'm about to say for two reasons, but I know it's not going to be two reasons. It's going to be either one or three or something, right? One reason that I think it's interesting is that as we saw, the Mishnah actually does seem to be talking about talking. It does seem to be talking about making noise or not making noise. And here he is saying like, no, actually, this is about the kind of things you say, right? So first of all, he's taking a different, he's adding something that maybe isn't obviously present in the Mishnah. He is adding something. He's adding a sort of character element to it. And the other thing is, right, what he's seems to be intentionally moving away from is the idea of, right, no matter what you say, it's better not to say it. Right. What he's saying is, yes, there are many things that it's better not to say. For example, it's better not to fight with people who insult you. Right. It's better not to get into like a road rage incident or whatever, call the manager when somebody like, it's better not to do all those things. Right. But there are things, presumably, that would be fine to say. And you don't have to worry about talking like those kind of speech. And I think that tendency is only, I don't want to say exacerbated. It's even more so in the Rambam, which is in source 5 and 6. The Rambam Maimonides wrote a commentary on the Mishnah, and he also wrote a compilation of laws called the Mishnah Torah. Avot is in the Mishnah, so he has a commentary in here. As is often the case, after I find a source, I'm like, oh, but this is interesting. Let me put the whole thing in here. As you can see, it's like 2 pages long, but that's okay. He goes through this whole thing about, right, somebody else has 4 types of speech and what's good and bad. And he is going to say the speech is divided into 5 parts. So this is at the bottom of the first page that you have, the Rambam, where it says source 5. I'll read it in English. It says speech is divided into 5 parts according to the Torah's obligation. We're commanded about it, right? Things that mitzvah, right? We're commanded, we're warned against it, right? There's sort of an all right. Disgusting, what he calls ma'us. And this commentary is actually written in Hebrew, I believe. So these are his words. The beloved, right, ahuv, and the permissible, right? Which is interesting because those things are not arranged in any spectrum. It's like they're really good, they're really bad, the nice, the not nice, and the neutral. Okay, and then he's going to describe what they are. So the first things that you're commanded, what are speech that you are commanded? What could those things be? Sure. Yeah, it could be right. Say, like, there are verbal commandments, right? Saying Shema, right? He's going to say even more. Reading Torah, studying it. That's great. Vidibar Taban is the pasuk, right? And this is the weight of all the other Torah. But he doesn't even, it's even past Shema, right? Shema is sort of like a ritualized, almost version of learning Torah, but learning Torah is a speech act here, just as we saw earlier in the Mishnah. And that's something that is commanded to do. Great. The second is the things that are forbidden. False test. And here it's not, for example, necessarily, well, it is a little bit, but we don't even think of these things as forbidden speech acts, but they are, right? False testimony, bearing false witness, right? Then you have lashon hara, cursing, that kind of thing. All these things that you shouldn't say at all. There's certain things that you should say as much as you can, or say a lot of. Certain things you should never say at all. The third thing is the disgusting things that are not a sin, like, which is, I mean, we might not call these basically like, talking about reality TV. I don't know, remodeling your kitchen. Remodeling your kitchen may come later. And he calls these things idle talk. From this division is also when a person disgraces a virtue, praises a vice, right? If you make a joke about something nice, right? The person did a good thing and you're like, oh, well, he looked funny while he was doing it or whatever. I don't know, you can mention a lot of things. That's sort of here where it's not good. It's not like a sin in the sense of like you bore false witness, but it's not good. Right, versus the beloved is when you're sort of in praise of intellectual virtues, disgrace of vice, right? When you're giving a musar shmooze, when you're telling a morality tale, when you are, telling the biography of an important person to inspire others to want to be like them. This is like your inspirational Facebook memes. I don't know. Your little like, darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Whatever it is, these things that people say, sort of inspirational speak. The study of virtue. So this isn't really the study of Torah, which, as maybe we'll see for the Rambam. Right, the study of Torah might include philosophizing, for example. Right, this is not really philosophizing. This is improving your character so that you can study the Torah and be a philosopher and do the right thing. So these are all good things. And the fifth thing, which is permissible, is like, what are we having for dinner? Should I take this job? They're like about your life and things that you should be doing in your life, but like they're not really neither here nor there, or could be. So now that we've divided speech, we know that we could say, which of these things is the thing that you're supposed to do less of, right? When we say it's good to be silent, does that mean you should be, in general, silence itself is a virtue? Or does that mean, okay, right, you shouldn't do numbers 1 and 3 or whatever, the bad kinds of speech? Or does it mean more than that? So he says, right, a person is praiseworthy and he minimizes the speaking even of the neutral division, right? What are we having for dinner? Men of ethics have warned about increasing words in it, but the forbidden and disgusting don't require a warning, right? When somebody tells you it's good to talk less, they're not talking about it's good to bear less false witness, because like you're not supposed to bear any false witness. What they're telling you is even the things that are totally morally neutral, you should talk less about them, right? But then the Rambam says, however, the commanded and beloved speech, if a person could speak in it all of his days, it would be good. Which means, right, there's nothing about being quiet that's inherently important. The problem is it's hard for us to always talk about the valuable things. Like this is sort of like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. If you could talk about Torah all day, then like go do that. That's what he says at first. And then he has his little however. He says, but, right, you should be careful that you're not just talking, you also do. That's the one. And the other is that terseness, right? You shouldn't talk too much. And that's one of the things I was thinking about when I opened this year, right? I can talk a lot about these things, and I'm talking about Torah when I'm also, and children's literature, but I'm talking about Torah. But maybe I could have given this whole share, I could have done this in fewer words, right? So the Rambam, on the one hand, he seems to be saying, if you're talking Torah, there's basically no limits. On the other hand, he's saying, right, like, use fewer words when you can. And we might want to interrogate that as to like, why? It could be that because that's actually better for learning. It helps you internalize. You could come up with different things. He doesn't have anything here about, say, an affirmative value of silence, for example. It's more about certain kinds of speech are bad and you should avoid extra. Which I think that actually is in the same family in a weird way as the Bartanura, who's basically saying, when the Mishnah says don't talk too much. By the way, we didn't see our Mishnah here, did we? No, but we will see it in the next thing. When the Mishnah says don't talk too much, it's talking about saying the bad things. This is the Mishnah Torah where the Rambam does not have this 5-part formulation. By the way, the Rambam in the commentary in the Mishnah, then he goes on in this little excursus about songs and singing and poetry, and how some, basically like morally virtuous songs and poems are great. And then he says, even if they're whether they're in Arabic or Hebrew, and some of the people think that Arabic songs are bad and Hebrew songs are good, but really it just depends what they're about. And in fact, like Hebrew songs that are about debauchery are even worse than Arabic songs that are about debauchery, because you're corrupting the holy language, which I think is like very much felt like if anybody here has ever been to like a chagiga of any sort for young people, where they're like, oh, like we're gonna play like songs about drinking, but they're like Israeli songs about drinking. So they're in Hebrew, so they're like Jewish, right? There's like, that is a thing that is still felt very contemporary to me reading him say that. And then people like me, like their curmudgeonly Talmud teachers are like, oh, they don't even know what the song means. Like, right, it's still a thing, and it's very interesting to the Rambam sort of reflecting that debate as having happened in his time. But here, instead of sort of commenting on the Mishnah and giving you this whole system, he's going to tell you some rules, right? You should always cultivate silence and refrain from speaking, except with regard to matters of knowledge, or things that are necessary for his physical welfare, right? Those are the two categories, right? Matters of knowledge, actually learning Torah, or maybe virtues, right? And then like, figuring out dinner and your business. It was said that Rav right? Never uttered an idle word. And then he says, what should not speak at length, even about matters involving one's physical needs, right? And this is why they said whoever speaks at length brings on sin. That's our Mishnah, right? Kol hamarbeh dvarim bevichet, right? The problems in our Mishnah are about he quotes both parts of our Mishnah out of order, right? Our Mishnah is talking about neutral speech. You should do less of it, but it's not talking about learning Torah. Even though here he does say you should be preached, but there's no concept of sort of silence as a virtue in and of itself, right? Actually, speaking Torah is the best thing. So I would say that's one view. And right, and it's related to the fact that for the Rambam, right, ideas are really important, and developing ideas and being a good philosopher is sort of like how you become a good person and a good Jew, and that's your highest like sort of level of development. So right, that you don't have one. I mean, whatever. I'm sure there are many ways of understanding the Rambam. I'm sure, but the Rambam is not someone we would associate with like, right, actually what you're trying to do is achieve some transcendental meditative state, right, for which you need quiet. Like that's not what he's doing, right? And he's not going to want to take that Mishnah in that direction. We'll see other people might want to take the Mishnah in a different direction, depending on their bigger philosophical system, right? So the Maharal is an example of this. The Maharal of Prague, sort of like a Kabbalistic-ish guy. So he says, he's reading this Mishnah. He says, this is source 7. And this is what I mentioned before, right? The fact that the Mishnah doesn't say la adam, I haven't found anything better for a person. What it actually says is for a body. The Maharal is going to pick up on that and say there's something about this statement that has to do with the embodiedness of people, right? Right. The fact that people are ba'al guf, the fact that people have a body is related to the fact that it's good for them to be quiet. Because, and he kind of says this he talks around this in a bunch of ways. You can read it if you want. Right. Speech is a physical act, right? Which is interesting. Speech is like not a super physical act. And sometimes in halacha, speech is not really considered an act, but like speech is a thing that you do with your body. And he has a big sort of mind-body dichotomy. And if you, right, even if you're speaking about important true ideas, right, it's better not to speak at all so that your intellectual faculty can be fully operational. Because as long as your body is operating, your intellectual faculty is not fully operating, right? We don't have, I don't know if it's like two mouths, right? The idea of two mouths was very much not in this, where you could have sort of part of you doing spiritual and part of you doing physical, but they would both be embodied. Here, like, to be really spiritual, you don't want to be embodied at all. So silence is better. Right? It says, right, because speech is the speaking soul. Nefesh medaber, it's kind of like ruach memalala, right? Asher nefesh medaber koach gufani. That's a physical faculty, right? Speech is a physical faculty. It's not fully intellectual. So if you want to really activate your intellect, you would sort of have silence and engage in just pure contemplation. Whether this like form of dualism, I saw some faces on one face, but right, whether this like kind of real dualistic approach is like attractive to us or feels real, it doesn't feel so real to me. And I think it feels very sort of like medieval, and I don't know what to say about it, but right, there's a few things that I think are interesting. First of all, that like it is true to notice that speech is it's embodied, right, in a way that maybe it's more embodied than thought, right? And for people who, the less you like bodies, the less you're going to like speech, and the more you're going to want things that are more ethereal. And the other thing is that, right, the Maharal, because he has this worldview, he's going to read this in a different way. And this is kind of what I was trying to say. I'll show two more examples where, right, you can have this sort of almost like innocuous thing of like talk less, and then depending on your general philosophical system, you'll take it in different ways. Which is why, as I said, I want to think about some more pragmatic, more ways that it comes out in halacha, where I think when it becomes less abstract, the question of talking or silence becomes less abstract. Maybe we can also see something a little more in detail about it. But I really like these two things. So I'm gonna go two more ahead. Two more examples of how, depending on your philosophical system, you could take this statement in a different direction. And I think both of these take it in a, say what you will about the Maharal, he's picking up on at least a word that was used there. Rabbi Nachman and Likutei Moharan here, it's actually related to last week's parsha, and then we'll see the next source. They're sort of really almost going to turn it on its head. Okay. I'm like sitting a lot with Likutei Moharan Samach Daled, which is source 8. On the other hand, I'm not sure I'm an expert in the cosmology that is required to make it make sense. So we're going to try a little, but maybe we're going to have to bracket some stuff. So Rabbi Nachman is talking about, he's talking very explicitly in this pretty long section of Likutei Moharan about, the encounter. How do you encounter God in the created world, using Kabbalistic ideas like, God is infinite, God creates what's called chalal hapanoi, like a God by doing what's called tzimtzum, by contracting God's self creates this void into which the world can be created, right? And that then God creates the world to have relationships with people, basically. That's like Kabbalah or Regalachat, something like that. But here's what he's going to say. He's going to read basically every word of this statement of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel as a little bit of metaphor. All my days, gadalti, I was raised among the scholars, and I found nothing better for the body than silence. And the main thing is not expounding, but practice, and speaking too much brings sin. So here's how he reads the first phrase. All my days, I was raised between the scholars. I did this translation, so I apologize in advance, right? No, actually, I didn't do this translation. This is one of the, I wrote where I did the translation. Safari has gotten like amazing at translations. Yes, Safari. So Beina Chachamim, between the scholars, is the aspect of the vacated space, the chalal hapanoi, that comes into existence and is made between the scholars as a result of the separation and dispute between them. How that works, I don't know. It's explained above, apparently. You can look into it. But there's some idea of just like the creative, God's creative capacity involves creating this vacated space. The creative capacity of the scholars expounding Torah, where the Torah is sort of God's representative, when they are at odds with each other, and there's what we could call there's distance between them, that actually also creates sort of some similar kind of creative space where maybe something else will come in to fill it, to fix it. So that's why he says, I was raised between the scholars, because he's referring to the vacated space. If that mechanism doesn't make sense to you, which I'm not sure it makes sense to me right now either, let's treat it as a background assumption for now, that we're talking about entering into the vacated space, right? Okay, and all my days I was raised, meaning I would raise myself. Okay, between the scholars and the chalal hapanoi, I was raised, meaning I was trying to lehit gadel, to become bigger, right? To sort of expand myself. Okay. Fine. And I found nothing better for the body than silence. Okay, makes sense, because in the vacated space, nothing is better than silence, as explained above, because entry there is forbidden for someone other than the aspect of silence. I'm going to leave this. I'm going to try and explain what I know or understand about this. And the more I'm talking about it, the more I'm like, this was way too big to try and put into like one little footnote of a class, but you'll forgive me. And maybe you'll be like, oh, wow, I really want to know more. And go read it. Earlier, one of the things Rabbi Nachman is talking about in this passage is about questions, philosophical questions, issues of understanding God. Rabbi Nachman does not like philosophy, sort of like anti-Rambam figure in this respect. He does not like trying to understand God through words and arguments, because fundamentally, right, we exist here, and between us and the infinite God, there's this vacuum of nothingness, and you can't transverse the vacuum with words. That's basically that's how I understand at least what he says. He uses a story about Moshe Rabbeinu to do this, but basically that. I'll tell the story, actually. Maybe it will make a little more sense. There's a story in which Moshe goes to the baby drush of Rabbi Akiva. Some people may know the story. He goes and he sits there and Moshe goes up to heaven. This is a story from hilkhot, and Moshe goes up to heaven and he finds God is adding these little like dots. They always translate it as jots and tittles, as if we know what that is. He's adding these little crowns to the letters. And he's like, hey, I'm here, God, why are you waiting? What's the delay? Why don't you just give me the Torah now? And God says, oh, well, these little markings are very important for somebody later who's going to come, and he's going to use them to interpret the Torah, which is similar to the space we are here, right? what Rabbi Nachman has done with our passage is similar to that of, right, like the interpretation of the Torah is what creates space. So somebody else, Rabbi Akiva, is going to come use these to interpret the Torah. So Moshe says, great, can I see him? God says, turn behind you. He turns, he's sort of like, and he's transported to Rabbi Akiva's baby drash. He sits in the back and he has no idea what's going on. He doesn't understand anything they're saying. And then finally a student says, Rabbi, how do you know this? And Rabbi Akiva says, oh, it's a halakha Moshe Sinai. It's a law that was given to Moshe at Sinai. And then Moshe feels better. Moshe is feeling like, well, basically, you have somebody who's so wonderful as Rabbi Akiva. Why are you even choosing me to give the Torah? And at least the way it's often read is Moshe sort of learns that he's part of an interpretive tradition, which he's going to begin, and other people are going to continue, and he feels good about that. And then he's like, wow, Rabbi Akiva seems really awesome. What was his great reward for being so awesome? And God says again, I skipped an important line, but I'll tell you in a second, right? God says, turn again, and he sees that Rabbi Akiva's flesh is being sold in the market after he was martyred by the Romans. And Moshe says, this is the Torah, and this is its reward, right? That's not fair, basically. How is that right? Sort of why are bad things happening to the people? And God says, shtok, and this is what God had said before also, be silent. That's what I decided, right? So Rabbi Nachman has read that story as saying, right, that question, the question of theodicy, is a philosophical question that can't be answered by philosophy, right? It's a question that can only be answered by some kind of, I think he would say supra, above verbal kind of experience or cognitive experience, which is what silence embodies. And that's what he's saying here. I know I just dumped a lot on the short people in the little time, but right. I'm going to go back and look at this again. What he's saying here is, right, to enter, when you're among the scholars, which, like I said, right, that's the stand-in for you're trying to enter the void, the thing that separates humans from the divine, right? The sort of the limits of our world, right? The outer reaches of the galaxy where there's really nothing. And you're trying to enter into that or transverse it to reach the infinite God or to understand the infinite God. When you're doing that, right, what you need is silence, right? You can't go through that space with arguments. You can only go through there with silence, right? Okay, right. That and in some ways, right, the more looking for something even more ethereal than sort of verbal thoughts. Okay. And then he says, "V'chol hamarbeh dvarim maybe marbeh chet," right? Actually, no, I'm not going to do that. Then he says, how is he going to read that? The main thing in all the expounding and the words that these scholars speak is not the expounding, but the practice. Practice ma'aseh. He's not going to translate it as asa from the idea of doing, but asa from the idea of making, right? Their words, they make and create the world. That the scholars, right, that this whole Mishnah is about the creative process of learning Torah and how the ordinary process of learning Torah opens up a space. But to really get into it, you could say, to really meet God in that space, you're going to need silence. You're not going to be able to do that through arguments. That's how I understand what Rabbi Nachman is saying from our Mishnah and from other sources. And I think that's, you can look at the last line if you want. It's going to explode a lot of things. There's already been too much here, I think. There's a few things there, which is that Rabbi Nachman is at least the first thing that I've shown you. I'm sure not the first thing historically in any way, but he's the first one here who wants to say, actually, right, this Mishnah is about not talking, not just not talking, but not having thoughts that are expressed in words, right? Because he doesn't like thoughts that are expressed in words in some fundamental way. He likes feelings, he likes attachment, he likes some sort of ethereal or transcendental connection, right? He doesn't like philosophy and arguments. He's the opposite of the Rambam. And so, I mean, that's totally anachronistic to say Rabbi Nachman is the opposite of the Rambam, but okay. Because he has this larger worldview, right? When he comes across a Mishnah like this, he says, oh, what this means is actually, right, that there's something you can achieve through not talking that you can never achieve through talking, or through the kind of things that you can express in talking, right? The kind of things that you can express in talking. Arguments, ideas, questions are not the things that can get you ultimately to God. They can get you part of the way, but they can't get you all the way. And that's a much it's a much more weighty, I would say, reading of our initial Mishnah, right? Like, I found nothing better than silence. Means literally like silence is the best thing. There's something about it. It's not because speech is a trap for the unwary, where if you talk about the wrong things, it's bad. It's because the whole project of talking is inherently constrained in some way. A little bit like the Maharal says the project of talking is inherently physical, but more than that, because Rabbi Nachman thinks the same things about, I think he would think the same things about arguments that could be articulated even if you're not saying them with your mouth. Right, so I think that's the first thing that sort of opens up this idea that there's something other than when we're extolling in the Mishnah silence, we're talking about a disposition, an approach to the world that's not about what we associate with words. Okay, I will pause for reactions if people have them. It looks like this is where I'm going to be. Okay. And maybe this will be the end or close to the end of what we do today. Does anyone know I don't know if people know what olat re'aya is. I translated it that way. In Hebrew, it's spelled the same as olat re'iyah, the offering that you bring upon like pilgrimage, like seeing God. Re'iyah is seeing. Olat re'aya, Reish Aleph Yud Hey is also the acronym for the name of, if anyone knows, Rav Kook, Rav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen. So this is his commentary on the Sidur, but apparently also on Pirkei Avot. And he's this I think is the best example of how this Mishnah can really mean anything to anybody. So like on the one hand, I hope this has been like an interesting exploration, but on the other hand, like that's why I want to sort of look at more concrete examples moving forward. So Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, this is my translation. I just forgot to put it down, so it's probably not so good. My whole our same Mishnah, I've always grown up among the sages, and I found nothing better for a person than silence, and action is not the most important, etc. Right? And he quotes a Zohar, which says that people, I'm going to summarize until I get to the underline, right? People who hear haru b'tshuva, who think about doing tshuva as they're dying, right? We sort of say you could do tshuva even until the last minute, and God, we say this on the high holidays, right? Ad yom moto techakelo, right? Even if somebody does tshuva on their dying day, God will accept them back. What if somebody just sort of thinks about it as they're dying? Well, I should do tshuva, but they didn't bring it out by mouth. So if we ask Maharal, he'd be like, "That's fine. Your mind." I don't know if he would say this, but he would say your mind is the main thing, right? The ta'amin tam in the Gehenna. So the Zohar says those people, they get a taste of Gehenna because they didn't fully repent, right? Full repentance would involve, for example, a confession. They didn't do that, right? And they're called b'nei basar, they're called fleshy people, right? Which is why there's a verse about that, right? And he's going to explain what the Zohar means. The Zohar says that people who do tshuva internally but not externally still have some sort of connection to punishment because they're in the flesh in some way. Even though I'm picking up reading before I said I would, I'm right here. Okay. Even though the faculty of thinking is the main part of humans, right? Right. Even so, right, from the body's perspective, in order to fully, it's actually like a little bit not clear to me how fully to parse this sentence, but it seems like he's saying, right, that right, from the perspective of his body, I would say because he is embodied, he needs for his full perfection some kind of speech. You can't just keep thoughts in your mind and feel like I did it. You have to bring them out, right? Like we're embodied, so you have to embody the things that are going on internally. Right? Speech is the way that you can kind of like perfect your body through, like, based on what's going on in your head. Okay. And people who do tshuva only mentally, even though they've sort of like saved their inner soul and that saves them from really going to hell, right? They're still b'nei basar, they're still fleshy in the sense that their body is unredeemed because they never use their bodily faculties to express their repentance. Okay? So that's what he means. Who are, right? I grew up among the sages, whose whole thing is intellectual. Lo matzati laguf, right? The body as a body, lo matzati, and he has the girsa, the text tov mishtika, right? Which means literally, I've not found for the body anything better than silence, right? But he's going to read it as tov yotzei mishtika. Nothing good comes of silence, right? Ki hamachshava levada eina poelet. Right? Thinking alone is not enough to redeem your body or to perfect your body. You need to speak, right? So he took the Mishnah and turned it completely on its head, right? I've spent my whole life hanging out with super intellectual sages, and I have learned that just thinking is never enough, right? That's why lo hamidrash hu ha'ikar ela ha'ma'aseh, you always have to bring it out into practice. And then he says, by the way, right, that's sort of the next thing, right? It's not just words. Silence is not enough. You have to bring things out into speech, and speech is not enough. You have to do, right? Which is completely inverted reading, I think, of our Mishnah in some important way, right? In some ways, it's not. It's actually scratching what I was going to say. The practical lesson is not that different from the simple reading of the Mishnah, which is don't sit around talking about nothing, right? Do important stuff and make sure that you're really living life according to your values and according to what's important, right? He would say the same thing, Rav Kook. But when he reads the words, lo matati laguf tov mishtika, instead of saying, right, talk less, do more, he's saying, actually what it means is there are times when you have to talk, when you have to bring things out into the world. Right, that your way of getting to ma'aseh actually goes through speech. Yeah, so that is a little bit of like a full circle, I think, on this topic, and maybe I am gonna. Well, I don't think I'm gonna. Maybe I'm gonna talk through. I think the Rama would not like what I'm doing now, which is talking through my own thoughts about what I'm going to do after this with you. But right, we saw the hilkhot, right? We started with I'll recap. We started with the idea that speech is a uniquely human faculty, right? It's part of what makes us who we are, according to the Targum on Bereshit, which is like a pretty old source that I think is pretty widely accepted. But we saw that there's a lot of anxiety, like Rabbi Shimon about how do you use speech, right? Maybe there's good things that you should be speaking all the time, and maybe that's even how you learn Torah, but at the same time, people seem to use speech for bad reasons. And we saw that then when you look at a Mishnah, like our Mishnah, I haven't found good for people, anything better for people than silence, that depending on your preconceptions, you can really read it in all sorts of different ways. You can read it as a criticism of particular types of bad speech, right? A sort of like negative or reactionary speech, or pointless speech, anti-philosophical speech, or you can read it as a criticism of any speech because speech is embodied, or you can read it as a criticism of sort of like philosophy and verbalizing certain ideas, or maybe you can turn it on its head and read it as actually a criticism of not speaking, right? If you're going to speak the right things. In some ways, Rav Kook is almost the more extreme. Rambam says, yeah, obviously learning Torah and speaking Torah is great. You should, you shouldn't do what I've been doing, which is start a bunch of sentences and restart them. You should think more carefully and, speak with a lot more deliberation. That's good, but speaking on those things is fine. Rav Kook is almost going one step further. He's saying, not only is it fine, it's necessary, right? If you just sit with an open book and all your thoughts, your Torah thoughts are in your head, that's not enough. You need to say them and then sort of do them in some way, or get other people to do them. I think that's sort of what we saw today. Yeah, I'll take comments, questions, or thoughts, and maybe I'll just preview next week. Read. And people are free to like raise their hand virtually, or if your camera's on physically, or to put something in the chat and I'll see. Yeah, go ahead.
Rabbi Nachman's thing about where the argument is being like the vacated space. I'm wondering like whether or not, I don't like for me, I think speech, a lot of when you're talking to people, or if you're talking out, it's like talking out an idea, or like the act of talking about it until you can further elucidate it with other people. Like that's not something that seems to be written about here. Like maybe Rav Kook gets there a little bit, but like, it's interesting that the vacated space is like the argument where the rabbis would have been like yelling at each other and trying to come up with a better answer, and like that's somehow, because it's an argument, it's like the space where God isn't. And I don't know.
Well, I think
It
I
makes
don't
sense.
want to speak too much about that because I think I'm like a little out of my depth. You might say, so why is it on the source sheet? I don't know. But I think that there is something potentially fruitful there. Two things about I mean, I'm also like a huge, not everybody is like this, by the way. I discovered when I got married, not everybody thinks through things by talking about them with other people, but I do. Right. I think that we could see that in two places. I'll talk about Rabbi Nachman in a second. One is that could fit into the Rambam's kind of fourth category of like speaking about virtues, right? It's not like you're actually philosophizing, but you're kind of like doing things that improve character. I don't know if Rambam would put it there, but I think you could easily put that there, right? It's sort of like the precursors to being a philosopher, right? I think in terms of Rabbi Nachman, there is a potentially, I want to explore potentially a reading of what he's talking about as, right? The reason arguments are generative in this way is because they actually do both, similar to God's creation of the world, where God both creates this space and then fills it, right? Like the arguments are they're both sort of creating the structure, the container, whatever it is, and also creating empty space that's going to then need to be filled by people interacting with each other more. That's one way that you might look at it, right? I'm not sure that he would say that, but I think that's possible. Right? Why exactly the machloket is the thing, right? The sort of the space between chachamim. I think there is something there about the fact that, right, different people are all perceiving different pieces of something, and that like there's never a full meeting of the minds because like the truth is impossible for anyone to grasp. That's what I would suspect. And I think he is maybe gesturing at like the generative possibilities of people interacting over ideas. Right. I mean, I think there's also like, there's a little bit of a tension, because on the one hand, he's saying, right, the chalal apnoi is like this generative space where you want to enter into, right? That's actually how he reads Bo El Paro, right? Come, last week's parsha, that's what I said, right? Come to Paro. Paro is the epitome of the sort of empty space with nothing, no values, no anything. And Moshe has to sort of enter into that to bring the Israel out. It says, but this is for Rabbi Nachman, it's not activity for everyone. This is activity for like the select few. But right, on the one hand, it's this sort of generative place, but on the other hand, it really is like this empty place of nothing where you could just like fall to it, into an infinite vacuum. So it's both a generative space, but also like a little bit of scary space. So I don't know if it's responsive. But there's more to explore. Let me just say briefly what I want to do. I thought I might have some left over. I didn't realize. As discussed, I didn't realize I was going to talk for so long. So next time I want to talk about Shabbat and how these things meet, which is actually comes out a little bit of discussions of creation and creativity and how speech is not a creative action. Rabbi Nachman, some of us, if you say a long Kiddush like the Rabbi in my show or my husband, you may say this passage from Isaiah 58, right? This is just a preview for 1 minute. Right? This is what the Navi is telling the people, this is what you should do. First of all, you should like set free all the oppressed people and give bread to the poor, and you should restrain your foot on the Sabbath, the karat al Shabbat oneg, right? So, right, you should stop doing your business on my holy day. You should call Shabbat holy. And then Pasuk Yudalid, right? Pasuk Yud, the end. You should honor it. From doing your normal stuff. From pursuing your ordinary pursuits. The daber davar, or speaking a thing. So, right, daber davar means speaking a thing, right? Speaking a speech. The translation here has already helped us by saying speaking of vain matters, but this is going to be one of these places where, like, well, what kinds of things are you supposed to, when we talk about speaking less or speaking differently on Shabbat, right? If there's some kind of speech that's not supposed to happen on Shabbat, what kind of speech is that? So next time, God willing, we'll explore that a little bit through some halachic sources. There's going to be, again, like I mentioned, like a Bavli or Shalmi maybe divide. That will be next week, I hope. And I hope I'll see you then. I'll stop so I know I don't actually see anyone's face, but that's okay. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for doing it.
Sure. Oh,
Or
I'm not
should
sure. Right, I think in terms of like the divisions between different kinds of Jews, that's actually something that's going to come out maybe next time about like what can you expect from people in terms of like, is everybody going to be like, the Rambam who just sits around philosophizing? By the way, the Rambam did not sit around philosophizing. He also did a lot of things that required speaking, but that's a good question. Maybe it will come up a little bit. Thanks all for coming, and I hope I'll see you next week. And nice to see you guys, the summer people and my other people. Bye-bye.
Ms. Gedwiser, and thank you to everyone who joined us. Quick plug, we've got lots of exciting things going on this week and coming up in the rest of spring Zman, including this week we've got an online Talmud shir with Dr. Shana Schick and 2 Yiddish translation workshops with Mr. Daniel Kraft. So please check that out at drisha.org as well as all of our other classes, and we'll see you next week. Thank you so much. I also want to plug Drisha semester, spring semester. I've been having like a lot of FOMO about Drisha classes lately. So if you have time, you should go to them because I can't. Go for me. Thank you so much.
Bye.